And what we're going to talk about today, some of this will leverage things that we have talked about, but for the most part, this is very, very new and different than anything we have talked about so far. But let's start with talking about something that we have done before, which is make use of the parameter statement. And we've done this before in really a large number of programs to this point. And you can see two examples of the parameter statement here. And we've already observed in other programs that you have written the way that we can leverage things that are already in the ABAP dictionary. And if we do that and those things are tied to a database table, then you've already seen how you can empower the user to do the F4 or entry selection help to see a list of valid choices. You've incorporated that into a few programs so far. What we haven't talked about is for data types that you would create, how you could do something like add input help. So let's just as an example here, let's say I'm writing a program, I have a parameter statement, and we'll just do ZN35 is my username, ZN35 ID. Actually, my parameter name will just make var1 type ZN35 underscore ID. So the idea is this is a custom type, but in particular, it's a data type that we're going to create in the ABAP dictionary. Now, in previous discussions, we've talked about how to define a domain, and you've done some things with that, so we're not going to rehash any of those things. But what I do want to show you is something we haven't talked about before, which is I'm going to go ahead and create this and make it a basic data element. And just to keep this really simple, it's going to be a, we'll just call this user ID. And we'll say that it is of a predefined type, which will make it integer, and we'll say it can only be a 2-digit integer. But the new thing I wanted to show you was this right here. Got to maintain my field label, so do that real quick, is documentation. If I click on documentation, then I am presented with a template which allows me to create documentation which the user can view related to input help. So for example, definition. I could put here a user ID is a 2-digit number identifying the user, used to identify user in simple calculations, dependencies, bless you, we'll just say none, examples. And this is when I could put in, whatever, but I'm just going to put an insert example here. Well, the point is, once I'm done with this, save this, go back and activate all of this. And that's fine, it's just a warning. And so now I'll go back to my program, and now if I press, and once again I've got to figure this out on my keyboard, if I press F1, there's the input help. And that's drawing from what I just typed a moment ago. So you probably have seen this input help and other things that you have done in your interaction with the SAP GUI. Here's how you would create it for your own user created data types. So that's something we have not talked about before that I wanted to show you, particularly useful when we are creating our own data types and want to provide for the user input help. Questions about that? All right, let's talk about event blocks. We have not done anything to this point in the semester with event processing. Event processing is fundamentally the idea that we can trigger certain portions of our program to occur either at certain points in the timeline of the life of a program, or, as we'll see here in a few moments, based on some action that the user takes at runtime. But the idea behind an event block is this is something that gets called by the runtime environment when, and the two things here, when either the user triggers something to happen, or in the life of our program, we have certain predefined event blocks that will occur. And we'll start with that latter scenario. We have, in a program that we have written so far this semester, we really have just had one block. Everything has been in the context of that one block, which represents the main functionality of our program. But let's introduce a couple new event blocks. There's an event block called load of program. And this occurs right at the very beginning when the program is first loaded and begins execution. Another event block, which you have seen, which we have been using, is start of selection. And this is the beginning of main processing. So actually, load of program happens first. The system does its normal setup behind the scenes, which we can now influence based on putting something in a load of program block. And then after the load of program event is over, then the start of selection event is triggered. So here's the scenario. We want to employ a more sophisticated parameter statement. Instead of our parameter statement just being a blank field, or instead of it being something that's actually hard-coded in, we want to create a default value for a field based on a calculation that we would do. So what has to happen here is the parameters field is painted on the screen of program block. So if we want to influence that, we are going to have to insert our own load of program block and do something with it to control this. So let me give you an example of this, and we'll write some code here together. So I'm going to go back to my very simple program here, and I'm going to change this. We'll just call this parameters date type D, and we'll say default. Now notice I can do this, default. Suppose I wanted this to default to today's date. Do I have a way of finding out what today's date is? Anybody remember that? Yeah, there's a system data object that will let me do this. And in fact, it is sy-datum. Okay, so what we will observe here when we run this particular program is that the default value for this field is now set to today's date. And of course, the user is free to retype that, April 11th, 1994. No problem with that. But in my program as it stands now, I can set it to today's date. Well, here's where this gets a little bit different. Suppose I wanted to set it to the date 7 days from now. You might say, okay, well, that'd be pretty simple. I could just make the default value equal to sy-datum plus 7, which seems very, very reasonable for us to, in fact, do. But notice, well, first of all, we've got red going on here, so that clues us into the fact that there's a problem. So let's try and solve that by creating a data statement here, and we'll do data future, actually I'm going to have to future date type D, and then do future date equals sy-datum plus 7. Okay, notice I don't have any red here. And then default future date. Okay, so let's see what happens when we try and run this particular program. And we get this. So if I wanted to set that field to just today's date, no problem there. But you notice here, I got nothing. Well, the problem is, or more particularly the scenario is here, when the computer looks at this code, it actually skips over lines 8 and 9 and jumps directly to line 10 because it says, ooh, a parameter statement, that's something I have to set up at the start of the program. So it paints the parameters field on the screen, and then it jumps back and starts on line 8 and 9, and at that point it's too late for it to actually give you what you wanted there as a default value. So as we just observed, this doesn't work. So how do I solve this? All I have to do is tell it, hey, don't skip over this code. I actually want you to process what is now lines 9 and 10 when you load up the program. So, load of program. So now I've told it explicitly, I want you, when you load up the program, don't just jump down there to the parameter statement, start right here where I'm telling you to start. And so let's see what happens this time. I'll save this. And there's my default date now, 7 days in the future. Okay? So the principle here is, anytime I'm going to hard code in the value of a parameter statement, or anytime I'm going to just use a default system value as is, I can do that like we've been doing thus far this semester with using the default clause on the parameter statement. But anytime I want a default value that has to be calculated or retrieved from a database, or it involves any kind of computational work for the system to derive that value, I'm going to have to insert a load of program block for the system to actually tell it to execute my computational code before it hits the parameters statement. Questions about any of that? So in your slide deck, I want to make sure we understand what this is right here. So, this works. This is where we started a second ago. Parameters date, like sy datum, just use a different data type here. Default sy datum, write date. So that will pre-populate the parameters field with the current date. And then what we observed is, although this looks like it should work, data past date, like sy datum, past date equals, and that should say sy datum minus 7 because past date hasn't actually been assigned a value there. So you might want to pen correct that. But the whole reason why this is in this red color here is because this code doesn't work. Okay? As we just observed a moment ago, I think we were trying to do it 7 days in the future in our example, and this is 7 days in the past. Same idea. That will not work unless I employ a load of program statement. Because once again, the load of program statement allows me now to put in lines of code that will be executed in order, as opposed to what happens here in this second block where the system just immediately jumps to the parameter statement, does that, and then goes back and catches up on all the other lines of code. So questions? It's just the way the eventing model works in ABAP. So that's the best answer I can give you. I don't know if I can explain why, but that's just the way they've written the language. Now, we have seen in programs that we have written that we can have a data type that is tied to a data domain, and the data domain limits the user's values that they can put in if we add to our parameter statement what's What do we add to a parameter statement to get it to check to see whether the value is valid based on the definition of a domain? Obligatory, make sure it's supplied. Check value checks to make sure it's consistent with its definition. So we have seen two things previously. We've seen obligatory, and we know what that does, and then check value, which checks it against the definition of the domain. Well, suppose I want to employ some kind of runtime check. So let's just say hypothetically, I want to ask the user for a date, and I want to make sure that that date is within the range of from 7 days ago to 7 days in the future. Okay, so in other words, if they specify a date that's further than 7 days ago or further in the future than 7 days in the future, I want to flag it as an error, but anything within this 14-day range is perfectly valid. How do I do that? I can't do that with a domain because a domain will let me specify whether or not it's a date, but this is a moving range of fields. So it's not like I want to go into the data dictionary every day and update the valid range of dates. I need my program to be able to dynamically calculate this. And as we observed a moment ago, what I really want to do is I don't want to check this on the back end and tell the user, hey, you know, you blew it, error. I want to be able to check it before I process my program. Here's another scenario. Remember our calculator program we wrote earlier in the semester where you asked the user for 2 values and an operator? Well, suppose we wanted to say that if the user put division in here as the operator, they could not put 0 in as the second number. That this combination was bad, and we wanted to make them fix it before they submitted it. In other words, we wanted to make it so they could not get beyond the submission screen with these values in place. How could we do that? Well, could we use a domain to solve this? And the answer is no, because 0 is a valid number here. It's just not valid when this is a slash. So we need something a little bit more complicated than we can get with just using a domain and a static value check. Now, obligatory could be useful because it's going to make sure they put values in, but obligatory in and of itself won't actually solve this for us. So how do we do this? Well, we can write logic that influences what happens at the user input screen by writing a block of code for the event at selection screen. And so let's look at that for a moment. This is very useful when we're going to use it to check the validity of data that the user has put in before we actually take it and move it into the main part of our program for processing. So this is what we're going to have. We're going to have a block of code that says at selection screen on and then list the field. And then we're going to have a block of code that we will run if the user types anything into that field name. So we'll see how this works here in just a moment. And the key will be in our code that we are going to write, if we discover a problem, then we're going to use the message statement and issue either a warning or an error message. And that will result in the warning or error message being displayed, the field being highlighted, and the user not being able to submit it until they have fixed that. So let's just look at, we'll start really, really simple, and then we'll build up to some of the examples that we have here on the whiteboard. So for what we're getting ready to do, I don't really need the load of program anymore. And we're going to go back to just a very, very basic parameter statement here to start with. We'll call this data is fine, and we'll just do parameter data type I, and we'll make this obligatory. And so I want to test what the user has put in here. So I'll do this. At selection screen on data. And I'm using data here because that's the name of the field. And then I just write what I want my logic test here to be. So here's my example. If data equals 14. For some reason, 14 is a bad number. So if data equals 14, then I write a message, I hate the number 14, and we'll make this a warning message. All right, so this is obviously a very silly program, but it's just intended to illustrate the fact here that the user is going to be asked for a number. If the user puts a number into this field, which they're going to have to because of obligatory, if the number they put in is equal to 14, then this message is going to go out to the user, and because it's of type warning, they are not going to be able to continue. And so let's put in the body of our program here, which will just be start of selection, write data. Okay. All right, so there's the data statement, and we type in 12, and we hit execute, and life is good. We get back a 12. We type in 14, and we execute, and you'll notice it turned the field red, and down here at the bottom it says, I hate the number 14. And there's going to be no way for them to continue with the number 14 in that field. Okay? So that's obviously a very artificial example of this. So let's look at now the two examples I put here on the whiteboard a moment ago. Let's start with this one. I want to ask the user for a date, and they have to give me a date within this range of the last 7 days or the future 7 days. So I'm going to do this, data type D for date, at selection screen on data, if data is less than sy datum minus 7, and let's put that in parentheses just to make sure that our order of precedence is right. So if this is more than 7 days ago, or data greater than sy datum plus 7, message date out of range. Okay, and just to show you the difference, I'll make this an error. So let's test this. Arithmetic expression cannot be compared with the non-numeric data. However, plus data can be used. Okay, so we're going to have to introduce a data D or data date type D value sy datum, and then I think what it's going to let me do here is date minus 7. See if it lets me get away with this. If not, we'll add more data objects to play here. Datum is not a constant. Oh. Okay. All right, now we're back to, all right, so I'm going to have to do this. We'll do date type D. And actually what I'm just going to do here is I'm going to do early date type D, late date type D, and then do early date equals sy datum minus 7, and then late date equals sy datum plus 7, and if data is less than early date or data is greater than late date. All right, I think we should have now gotten rid of all the systems complaining. All right, so today is March 28th, 2017, so 03/28/2017, so I'm just going to give it today's date, and it took it just fine. All right, so now I'm going to try and give it a date 4 days in the past, so 3/24/17, and it took that just fine. Now I'm going to try and give it 3/14/2017 and a date out of range. Okay, so I had to add a few more lines of code there progressively as we went along, but I think all of you should have no trouble at all understanding what's going on here, where we grab today's date and then use it as the basis of our calculation. So once again, the reason why I can't do this with domain data is because this is a rolling set of dates. And so every time this program is run, it's going to have to be between those ranges there. Any questions about this? All right, so let's do one more that would be similar to this scenario here with wanting to catch division by 0, but we won't write the full program, obviously. But we will put up 2 parameters fields. We'll put up a parameters field called data, and this is where we'll grab the integer, and then we'll do operator. We'll just call it operate, type C, length 1, obligatory. Now, we could have this tied to a domain, and in previous examples we did this to make sure that the user gave us a valid mathematical symbol here. Now you notice there's a couple different ways that I could trigger this event. I could do @selection screen on data and attach it to that field, or I could do it on operate. The key is, what field do I want highlighted when I trigger the error condition? And so if you think about it, if the user types in a 0 and a slash, which field do you want it to turn red in the event that that's a bad combination? Do you want the 0 to turn red, or do you want the division to turn red? And I'm just going to arbitrarily decide that I want the slash to turn red. So what I will do here is @selection screen on operate. Get rid of all of this. If operate equals, and I think we use that slash right there, and data equals 0, then message cannot divide by 0. All right, so let's see what happens here. So if the user puts in 13 and a slash, and then we execute, there's no problem. But if the user puts in 0 and a slash, then we have a problem. You cannot divide by 0. Alternately, now they could back this up, or they could change it, but you know, any number 0 here is fine as long as the symbol is not the division symbol. Okay? So this is an example of eventing. We can use the at selection screen on syntax to do as sophisticated a validity checking as we need on input from the user. Any questions about this at all? So just to be clear here, you could, if you wanted to, ask the user to give you something that you could then look up in a database. You know, so hypothetically, you could ask the user to type in a password, and then you could use that password to query a database to see if the password matches a password in the database, and the program won't run unless the user types in the right password. I mean, so you could do any degree of sophistication you would want here. The key is, and what I like about this in particular, a lot of programming languages, the user sends you their input and you can generate an error at that point. But what this is allowing you to do is to make sure your program never actually gets to the heart of the program. You're never going to get to start of selection if the user hasn't cleared up any error conditions associated with the input on the front end. So you can write your code much more concisely in the main part of the program.
I have a quick question.
Yes?
If you had more than 2 parameters, there's a good chance that you're probably going to have multiple at selection screen on.
Mm-hmm.
Just continue down, or can you do and operate and data? You can't do conditional statements on that.
Run that by me again now.
Like at selection screen on operate
Mm-hmm.
data, and then do conditional statements inside of there. If you had to do multiple at selection.
I don't think you can, but let's take a look at here. Let's just see what kind of system help we are afforded with the at selection screen statement. At selection screen events, you can see there's not demo selection screen events. Oh, this is fun. They actually wrote a program for us here. I don't know that we can actually look at the program source code, which seems kind of weird to me. Let's see if the quick reference holds any. All right, so here's what I've showed you on and then the name of the field, but you can do at end of and process it, on radio button group, on help request, on value request, so or on exit command. So let's just see, for example, I didn't notice the one about on help request for. So let's just see, just out of curiosity, what we could do there if in our program, find our program again, if we did at selection screen on, and the syntax here was help request for, and then the name of the field. So on help request for operate, and then we could just let's see if it'll let us write just a normal write statement here. I think we're still going to have to use messages write hello. Thank you. Couldn't tell if that was the cursor or what's going on there. So here now, if the user presses function F1, yeah, I didn't think it would like the write statement there. Let me go back and change this to a message statement. Message, hello, and let's see if I can actually do it of type I for an informational message. Shift, or it's actually function F1. No documentation available. That's interesting. Must be looking for something different than a help request, or than the F1 button press there. But I would go back and look through these examples right here. We haven't talked about blocks You read about it in your book where you take a set of input fields and put them all in one bounded box. So you can trigger an event check related to an entire box, which might be useful for what you're trying to do here. I don't see, let's see if they have an example of this one right here we could look at on help request for. I'm not seeing an example where they do the on help request here, even though that's what it's listed under. So I would look at that.
Does it matter that you have the cursor on not the operator but the other one when you hit that point?
It very well could.
Because you have it request for operator.
Oh, I didn't have it in the right field. Thank you. Yeah, you're exactly right. Let's try this again. Function F1. See, I'm not sure now. This is one of those where I don't, there we go. So yeah, that was what it was. I just had my cursor in the wrong field. And so when the user hit F1 there, it popped up this dialog box. So you can grab any element of the user interaction on that main screen with any of these options that are there. Okay. Other questions? I had one more example. I was going to ask you to do it on your own, but we'll go ahead and just do this together. Suppose we wanted to prompt the user for an integer, and we wanted them to give us an even number. And so how could we solve that? Let me give you about a minute to write what you think would work for that, and then we'll type it into the editor here. So how would we check to make sure that the user has in fact given us an even number? All right, so I've already spotted you the @selection screen statement. So what is my test here? Who has code that they think works for this?
Is the mod feature still just pencil or sorry? What are we trying to say?
No, mod is actually it's the word mod. So what did you have there, Ben? You apparently had something.
If number mod 1.
Okay, so it'd be if data is the name of the variable, and then you want mod 1.
And then this was probably pseudocode in my mind, but then I wrote the message, and then I wrote mod 1, and then wrote message. I didn't complete my thought, but that's what I had so far.
Okay. Anyone want to chime in with yes?
Would it be mod 2?
I think it would have to be mod 2. Okay.
Doesn't equal 0?
Did you say doesn't equal 0? Is that what you had?
I did.
Okay.
I did the not equals.
Okay, so if data mod 2 is not equal to 0, you must enter an even number. All right, so let's test this out and see if this works. So incorrect nesting before the start of selection, the control structure, must be closed by end if. End if. All right. Okay, so if I put in a 4, I should see 4 get printed on the screen. If I put in a 5, then you must enter an even number. Okay? Let's test some others. 0. 0 should be fine because 0 is even. -1. -1 is no good because that's odd. -4. -4 should be just fine, and in fact it is. So yes, this is one way to write it. If data mod 2 is not equal to 0, then you have to enter an even number. You could also, I think, do if data mod 2 equals 1. It's going to get you the exact same place. And I'm sure there are other variations on this theme that would work. But yes, the modulus calculation is what you need to solve this in this situation. All right. So, whoops. Now on to kind of the last new thing here, which is what we have been talking about in the last few minutes is input-related events, things on the parameter screen. Now let's look at output-related events, which is the idea that once we have actually painted output to the screen, all of our programs to this point, that's been the end of their life. Well, no longer will that be the case. We can now actually paint something to the screen and continue our interaction with the user, albeit in a different way. We have an event called @line selection. When outputting a list, which is what we do when we use the write statement, the @line selection event is triggered when either a line is double-clicked or the user chooses the choose icon. And I'll show you what that is here in just a moment. Now, so what's going to happen is we've actually written something to the screen and we want to capture the fact that the user has double-clicked on one of our lines. So really what we have here is, and we'll write a very basic program to illustrate this. We can get rid of all of this, not going to take any data from the user here, and we can do, we'll just put in a start of selection, and we'll write out to the screen here, hi, I was going to write hi mom, but since the word data is already there, we'll just write hi data, okay? But then I'm going to do this, @line selection, right, you just selected a line. Okay, not super fancy, nothing super sophisticated, but the last statement is not complete, missing a period. Thank you. All right, so there's my hi data statement, and I double click, you just selected a line. Okay, so what happens here now is every time the user double clicks, which is what I illustrated, that event gets fired. By virtue of the fact that I have an @line selection, you might not have noticed it at first, but I picked up this new little button right here, which is the choose button. So instead of double clicking on a line, I could just single click on the line and then hit the choose button. Okay? Now, as a point of fact, you could think of this almost like being recursive, because every time I double click on output, that event's going to fire, which means that if I double click on this line, the event just fired again. Now, it painted the exact same thing to the screen, so you really couldn't tell that that's what actually happened. But notice my back button here backed up once, backed up twice, backed up a third time to end the program. So that kind of showed you the nesting level. So how do we control the nesting level? Well, there is a system maintained data object, sy-lsind. I don't really know what that's an abbreviation for. Maybe line something indicator, I don't know. Starts out at 0 for for the initial list output and is incremented each time the event fires, and it's decremented every time the user moves back. So just to make this really, really simple, let's do this. Hi, instead of writing out hi data, I'm going to write out this variable. So I'm going to write out hi, and then sy dash lsind. So when that gets written to the screen on line, what is that, line 9, what will that write out to the screen? It'll write hi 0, okay? And then at line selection, I want to add SYLSIND to this as well. Right, you just selected a line, SYLSIND. Okay, so hi 0, you just selected a line 1, you just selected a line 2, and this just keeps going and going and going and going. And then notice every time I hit back, I'm just kind of navigating back through my stack here. So what I have now is the ability to do this. I can, in my at-line selection event handler, I can handle particular scenarios. For example, I could do this. If sy-lsind equals 7, write you found the magic level. Okay? And if. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you found the magic level. And then 8, 9, 10, and then as I back up, when I go back, I fire the event handler. So the key thing to keep in mind what's happening, in your brain here is every time I double click, the at line selection event gets fired. Any non-conditional code just gets executed. But if I want to associate a particular action with a particular sequence, then I just write an event handler for that level, if you will, by testing the value of my, what we'll just call the level counter here. Yes, sir?
And you may have said this and I missed it, but with the, let's just say, the startup program code statement, everything under it would be executed before the program ran, correct? Or how does it know what you're...
If I'm going to use load of program, I need to also use start of selection to delineate the preliminary block from the normal block. In this program right here, I have no preliminary block, so really that, I believe, would just be viewed as totally optional. And the program works just fine. So I don't always have to use start of selection, but anytime I use the load of program event handler or the selection screen validity checking, then I have to introduce start of selection into the mix.
But under at-line selection right there would be done at-line selection only. Right?
You got it.
There's no way to end that sequence and put something else after it without using like start of selection?
No, that would typically then, couple different ways to handle this. You could employ at-line selection to go into the event handler, and then you could have a case statement based on SYLSIND to say, when you're at level 1, do this, when you're at level 2, do this, when you're at other levels, do this. So you could employ that kind of logic. And what's unusual here is a lot of times all of your at-line selection code would be conditional. So if I did that, to a certain degree, it doesn't, see, there's no way This at-line selection is an event, so everything is considered to be part of that event until I enter another event block, which is why I usually just make this the last thing in my code, is these double-click event handlers. Okay. Good questions. Other question? All right, so just to give you one piece of terminology here, when you are writing at the at-line selection event, I made the observation that the write statement is actually called list output. When you are doing a write statement in an event handler, we typically refer to that as a detail list. And so what this does is it gives you the ability to support what is often called in a user interface drill down. Now, there's a challenge here. Suppose I want to write out to the screen. Where's an eraser here? Suppose I want to write out to the screen a list of items. And just for the sake of my example here, I want to write out to the screen apple, orange, grape, cherry. And I want to be able to, when the user double clicks on it, say, I'm glad that you like grapes, or I'm glad that you like oranges, or I'm glad that you like apples. So my response would not be hard-coded in. My response is, if you will, going to actually grab values from the individual line that the user has double-clicked on. And I don't want to do this. So how do I do this? How do I figure out what the user has actually double-clicked on? Now, the first question is, could I do it with sy-lsind? Well, not really. I can do at-line selection, but that will move me to the next level, if you will, in my output. And at that point, I would know that I was at level 1, but I don't know what word or what line the user actually double-clicked on. So I can do that by adding to the output on screen 1 the hide statement. And the hide statement allows me to designate values that will be passed on. So the idea here is that I can capture information or send information to the other side in a data object. So when the list is output, hide can be used to designate values that will be passed on, called the data transport. The data object that is hidden might or actually might not be part of the actual output. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's go back here and let's work on the first part of this. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write, and I'll try and mimic exactly what I have here. Apple. A-P-P-L-E. But I'm going to do one other thing here, which is this. I'm going to do data, fruit, type, string. And then I'm going to do fruit equals apple. And then just to illustrate this, I'm going to write out fruit and then I'm going to hide fruit. Okay, now before we keep going, let me do a syntax check on this, and then let's talk about what's happening here. Okay, right, correct. Fruit cannot be a table. Oh, fruit can't be a string? Never seen that before. So type C, length 12. All right, so here's what's actually happening. I'm creating a variable for the sake of using it to pass data downstream. And so I'm setting the variable here to Apple, and then I'm going to write out to the screen Apple, but then I'm also going to hide the current value of fruit, which is Apple. Well, we need to continue this pattern now. I could, if I had a database table that had fruit in it, I could write code to do this, but for this example, we're just hard coding in a bunch of stuff here. Orange. So I'm going to write out orange and then hide orange, and then grape, and then lastly cherry. Now, let's just save this and run it for a second, and let's understand what's going on. I have written out 4 different lines that say apple, orange, grape, and cherry. But what neither you nor I can see is that behind the scenes, every one of these lines has a variable named fruit set, and the fruit value is either apple, orange, grape, or cherry. So now I can do this. At line selection, write, I am glad that you like fruit. All right, so I double click on apple. I'm glad that you like apple. Orange, I'm glad that you like orange. Grape, I'm glad that you like grape. Cherry, I'm glad that you like cherry. Okay, so see what's happening here. Let's go back and look at this program for a second. I'm hiding. It just so happens here that what I'm writing out to the screen and what I'm hiding are the same. Doesn't have to be. But any data that I want to pass upstream, I just hide that value. And in fact, I could hide multiple things. But whatever is hidden associated with a line is what gets passed upstream as the value of that particular variable. So this is kind of like parameter passing, but usually we associate parameter passing with things like calling a method or calling a function. Now, there's a problem with this program. Can anybody spot what the problem with this program is? I've told you enough for you to perhaps be able to pick up on it, but it's very, very subtle, but it's a way that you definitely need to start thinking when we start writing programs of this sort. My event fires anytime the user double clicks. So watch what happens when I run my program and I double click on Apple and then I double click on this line. Okay, I'm actually continuing to fire events. And it just so happens that the value there is not actually changed. But watch this. Watch what I could do here after I unroll all of this is I could write this, and now I could hide in this line, well, let's set fruit equal to now we're going to see actually more clearly what's going on here, apple, and then I'm glad that you like blah, blah, all of this. So actually, the way this code should be written is, well, how do I fix this code right here? To have it only support one level of drill down. Absolutely.
You really
If,
wouldn't want quick clicking on Apple.
I like that. Okay, if sy-lsind equals 1, I'm glad that you like fruit. And what I'm actually going to do this is end if sy-lsind greater than 1, write leave me alone. Okay. Obviously, you'd want your program to be a little bit more polite, but let's see what happens here. So now, I'm glad that you like apple, and in fact, I can back up and I can double click on grape. I'm glad that you like grape. Orange, I'm glad that you like orange, but if I double click on this, leave me alone. Okay, and in fact, every time I double click on this, I still get, leave me alone, but then I back up through the stack there. So it's very, very common in your event handler to have to think about, okay, the first time they double click on it, here's what I want to have happen. The second time they double click on it, here's what I want to have happen. And it could well be that what happens here is you have your main program output, and then in your sy-lsind equals 1, you might have the equivalent of a whole program in there. One of the things that you're going to get to do as your next homework assignment is you're going to, in your main program, retrieve information out of a database. And then when the user double clicks on one of the lines, you're going to pick up the information from that line and use it to do another database query and produce second level output. And then if the user double clicks on something at that next level, then you're going to produce another set of output that will be a product of a database query. So you could actually have a pretty large block of code here in what's commonly called the event handler for that particular end user event. Yes, sir?
Is there a way to, in that example we've got right there, instead of saying like leave me alone, is there a way to go back to the first screen?
I don't think so, but let's just see. Let's see what happens if I try and put sy-lsind on the left side of an equal sign. I think it's going to complain about that, but let's check for sure. All right, it didn't complain, so let's see what happens here. I'm glad you liked apple. Okay, never done that before, never tried that before, but look at that. That works like nobody's business right there. So you can in the stack as would be appropriate. So what's actually happening here, just to make sure we get this, is your first screen is painted, and then if the user double clicks on it, you go to the next screen. That first screen is still there. It's just kind of move out of your ability to view it, and this is brought into focus. And then what we're seeing here is that then the user double clicks again, and it brings the third screen into focus. But then at any point in this process, if we wanted to, instead, we could send it back here just by setting the value of sy-lsind. But what we're having to do here is we're having to write these event handlers. So let me show you a more complex example, and then we'll be done for today. All right, so here's a program that's going to select information from a database table. Select carrier ID, connection ID, airport from, airport to, departure time from SPFly into a dynamically created table, iTable SPFly. Then we're writing out output, and you see the statement there, loop at, so we're going to loop through the internal table into a work area. We're writing out the work area values, but then notice this, in every line, we're going to hide the carrier ID and the connection ID associated with that line. So if you think about it, I've got to figure out what data I want to hide. Well, now I have my event handler. Line selected if S equals 1. So I'm going to write out flights for connection, and I'm going to write out the connection ID on carrier ID. So where did it get this from? Those are the two variables that I did, carrier ID and connection ID. Then you'll notice I have another select statement, and I use as variables in that select statement WA carrier ID and WA connection ID. So I'm using the values that I was passed as part of the where clause here and producing output. Okay, so let's look at this program, which I believe I already have loaded up in my SAP GUI as one of these. Here we go. This is the exact program we were just looking at. So when the user runs it, they get this list. Carrier American Airlines from JFK to, I think that's San Francisco, leaves at 11 o'clock. Well, so I want more information about this flight right here. It's on AZ. I don't know what carrier that would be. From FCO to KIX. So instead of double clicking on it, I'm just going to show this. I'm going to hit the choose button. And so I should expect to see flights from FCO to KIX on carrier AZ. So flights for connection 790 on carrier AZ, and it gives me the date of the flights, the total number of seats, and how many seats are open. Now it's just pulling this from the database, and as a point of fact, you can see it's showing me flights that took place in the past. You know, I might want to change my logic a little bit to only pull upcoming flights, but nonetheless, anything here that the user double clicks on, it's going to show you information on that particular flight. But then notice the way my program here is written. Watch what happens here. If I double click on this guy, you know, you might say, oh, I'm not getting any output. As a matter of fact, I am. But I'm just getting the same output as a moment ago. And in fact, if I come up here and double click on this, you know, I'm actually getting output as we can assert by the fact of the way my back button works. But we've already seen what we could do here as a way to solve this. We could just do if sy-lsind equals 2, then sy-lsind equals 0, and if. And so now the way this particular program is going to run is I double click on this particular flight to get this information, and then if the user double clicks here, we go back to the main screen. Okay? Now I could continue to have more levels of actual drill down if I wanted to. It's totally within my control. I just have to capture which level of drill down I'm at by testing sy-lsind or using it on the left side of an equal sign to actually set it to a value. Any questions about any of these things?
If for whatever reason you were drilling down and then the next page had parameters, do you go through the same process that we talked about earlier as far as?
You can hide things on this. You can hide things at every level of input here, or every level of output. So anytime you have a write statement, you can have a hide statement associated with it. Okay? All right, so we're done for today. On Thursday when we get together, I will have your next homework assignment ready for you, and it will be based on this drill down that we have looked at today. Have a great rest of the day, everyone, and I will see you when we get together on Thursday. If you did not sign in, the sheet is here up the front, so make sure that you take a moment and go